Welcome to Arctic Frontiers Unpacked. Here today with me I have research professor Gørild Heggelund, expert on China and also China in the Arctic. And today I want to ask you some questions about China in the Arctic. As it's an emerging topic, getting more and more relevant. So when we talk about China in the Arctic, it seems almost often that it's something new or something new of a topic that has emerged, but that's not really true. China has some interests historically in the Arctic as well.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this little talk. Yes, well, China has had a little bit of history with the Arctic. You know, it signed the Svalbard Treaty in 1925, and also the Polar Research Institute of China was established in 1989. And also China has been involved, in scientific research on the Arctic and in the Arctic, and also joined the International Science or Arctic Science Organization in the 90s. So it has had some history of Arctic research and interests in the Arctic, basically or largely, interest in science and, climatic changes and how it would impact on China's climate, for instance. And then China was accepted as an observer state in 2013. And also it announced its Arctic policy in 2018. So you can see there's kind of like a progress or like a process here. China had many, statements by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I mean, that's the ministry that is kind of in charge of the, the foreign policy, and Arctic, of course, is also part of foreign policy somehow. So they had many statements by ministers along, during many years, and the white paper, as it's called, China's Arctic policy, it's called the white paper, was kind of, there was nothing really very new in the Arctic policy. It was kind of like a collection of many of statements or interests that China had announced earlier. So, but at least, they came out with their policy paper. So kind of, signifies that, China has interest in the Arctic. And the paper, the Arctic policy paper, it concerns many areas, including, of course, its starting point is environment and climate change. It says, that the Arctic is melting fast. It has global repercussions. Also it impacts on China. So that's why, we need to be in the Arctic. We need to kind of understand what's happening in the Arctic, so we can also understand what's happening, in China, for instance. And actually, China is very vulnerable to climate change. I mean, China doesn't really talk so much about it, maybe outside of China, but if you follow Chinese climate policies, as I do, we see that actually, vulnerability, adaptation, climate impact is a very big challenge for China. So relating to the Arctic, so that was kind of like the starting point for when you read, the Arctic policy paper. That is how it begins. But then, of course, it lists many areas that China is interested in, such as, shipping, for instance, energy, resources, also tourism, but definitely climate change and environment. So. Yeah, so that's kind of like a brief kind of introduction to China's kind of interests in the Arctic. And it continues to have interests in the Arctic and has, there has been some, discussions around, and also, what is China's ambitions, or what is China's motives in the Arctic, actually? I mean, does it have any other interests than what they have, kind of listed in the policy paper, such as military interests, which is not, these are not mentioned at all in the policy paper. So, many things to look into when you talk about China in the Arctic.
Thank you. And it sounds like there are many pillars and many reasons that China has to engage with these kinds of affairs. And what you mentioned environment, and you mentioned the fact that China is very vulnerable, and as we all know, not only what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, but it's kind of the world ecosystem is connected, and we can't escape that. So it makes sense that there is narratives around that. But I have a question to you when it comes to the white paper, because it came out in 2018, and China has also become an observer to the Arctic Council. There is an increased interest there, and this is mainly by rationalizing that interest through the environmental perspective. So I'm wondering, do you think that Chinese participation in the Arctic Council has had any effect on their policy interests, or vice versa? Is there any dynamics there?
Well, I think the good thing about China being an observer state is that they can participate in the working groups of the Arctic Council, and China does have quite a few scientists that are involved in the work of the working groups. The good thing, I think, or the benefit from that is that China will bring back some information on what's happening in the Arctic into China. So to understand some of the challenges that exist in the Arctic, and also that could be useful also inside China. So what is interesting to a certain extent is that many of the things, or the topics of the working groups of the Arctic Council, is that they also coincide with many of China's actual their own actual policies, environmental policies. So you could say that they could input directly into Chinese policy somehow. But then also Chinese researchers, academics, they're a very strong scientific community in China that also can contribute to working groups in the Arctic Council. So that is, it's a two-way kind of, how do you say, win-win situation somehow. So I think, one should try to aspire to include more Chinese scientists in the working groups of the Council. As these, issues that are, being researched in the Arctic Council, I mean, they are global issues, and the Arctic, it has, the melt and like mercury, for instance, black carbon, all those topics are really important for the world. And, China, has had some, the bilateral relations between Norway and China, for instance, these are topics that have also been part of projects between Norway and China, state-to-state cooperation. Mercury has been ongoing for many years. So, you see synergies between what's happening in the Arctic and what's happening in China, and also what's happening on bilateral and regional levels.
Thank you. And it's also very relevant when it comes to the black carbon as well, because the emissions that's essentially the black carbon emissions that affect the Arctic, they're coming from China, many of them. But and it seems you're showing this symbiosis, you could say, in the terms of environment. But 4 years after China came with their first Arctic white paper, Russia went to war against Ukraine. And this has, as we all know, this has created many repercussions, and also essentially been affecting China and the Chinese position in the Arctic, maybe also the position towards the West, or the West position towards China. So I was just wondering, could you comment a bit on what has changed, what happened after 2022 for the Chinese position in the Arctic?
Yeah, it's a long story, I guess. No. Well, what I think, first of all, I think because China did not condemn Russia's invasion in Ukraine, that has impacted on China in many ways. Its relations with Europe, its relations with the Western countries, the U.S., but also you have the U.S.-China trade war that started, started under Trump, his previous period. So there has been kind of a gradual development there. So for China, I think there's more suspicions around China's motives in the Arctic, and countries are reluctant a little bit to let China in, which was a very different picture before, because then like Iceland, Greenland, I mean, they're all kind of, they invited China in kind of to come and invest in their countries. But I think what we see is that, because the China-Russia relations are perceived, to be very close, it is, more difficult for China to operate in the Arctic and to invest or, engage in the Arctic. And another factor is that, the discussions around dependency upon China with regard to renewable energy, electric vehicles, critical minerals. So that has also come into play very much in this whole pot. I mean, everything is kind of put together in a big pot, all these challenges. And so it's hard to distinguish between, these different things, what is making it so difficult for China. I mean, China was trying or had conversations with Kirkenes port as well, and has got a lot of attention here in Norway. So there's more difficulty or challenges for China to engage in activities or invest in the Arctic these days. But interests are still there. I mean, also the Northern Sea route. China has had interest, of course, in the Polar Silk Road, as it's called, but it didn't really develop so much in the past few years. Also, well, COSCO, the big shipping company, didn't really go through the Northern Sea route for a while, a couple of years. At least after 2022, there has not been a lot of traffic in the Northern Sea route. And that we think, is related to the fact, that Russia's war in Ukraine, and China is also very concerned about, secondary sanctions, if it gives too much support to Russia, for instance. We have examples of that China has, with regard to, for instance, Yamal Energy, where China has invested. That they were, producing one of the modules for Yamal Energy too, and that they have, been careful about that. So, there are many examples that show that China is also kind of impacted somehow by, the change, I think, in the Western countries, the U.S., towards China. And of course, at the time, when China came with its policy paper, it's called, China had stated it is a near Arctic state. And of course, that was not taken lightly by many, like the US, for instance. And Pompeo, in 2019, he gave a speech where he said there are no such thing as, or there is no such thing as a near Arctic state, only Arctic states or non-Arctic states. So that was kind of a shift, I would say, in like the U.S. and Western countries, perhaps attitude towards China in the Arctic. So yeah.
So it sounds like the shift has, of course, been prominent after 2022, but also, as you mentioned before that, for already in 2019 we have these kinds of geopolitical, you could say, issues,
yes,
being very prominent. And you mentioned investments and the difficulties and sometimes incentives for Chinese investments in the Arctic, and also the previous Trump presidency. So, of course, we are now faced with a new Trump presidency, and one that has its eyes on Greenland, and also that maybe assumes that the Chinese eyes are on Greenland to a very large extent. And of course, with the issues of either its critical minerals or its investment in developing, showing presence in the Arctic, China has been a talking point to an increased degree in this kind of topic. So what I'm wondering, and what I want to ask you as like a China expert, what is the situation when it comes to the Chinese interest in Greenland? Is it as prominent as it is maybe portrayed, or is it a little bit more nuanced?
Well, I think it's a little bit more nuanced, as you say. China has definitely showed interest towards Greenland, and there were some attempts, to invest in certain aspects of. There was a Hong Kong-based company trying to invest, I think, in a former naval base, Danish, there, and also by Chinese companies who to invest later than in. I think it was 2019, maybe, or before, in runways for Greenlandic airports, for instance, but which was stopped by Danish government. So, I mean, China has definitely been interested in Greenland, and also for the reasons you say, the minerals that we know exist in Greenland. But basically now, I think it's not. There's not so much. In Greenland, I mean, they're not really that present at the moment. So it's a bit unclear why, Trump is saying, China, is using China as a kind of a reason for the U.S. to kind of not take over, but to have this interest in Greenland, because China is not really there right now. But of course, we don't know in the future if it could have some interests, of course. But it's kind of a reflection of, I think, the relations now between China and the U.S. and the competitive relations, the competition between them in many ways. China has been successful in many ways. It has, in the recent years, it has lifted a lot of people out of poverty. China has modernized. It's like it has. Invested in core areas like renewables, energy vehicles, etc., and has become big in the world. I mean, in these areas, and that's a challenge it challenges both the U.S., the European Union. So we see certain, policies that are reflecting this. Like for instance, the EU will introduce or have already decided to have tariffs on Chinese-produced vehicles, for instance. So there's like a ongoing competition right now, and also much suspicion, I guess, against China and its, the interests of China, in Europe. But actually, China is quite dependent also on the European Union or Europe, I guess, for export. So. It also wants to have a good relationship with the EU and also with the US, I think, actually. But, sometimes, Trump, he can say a lot of funny things, I think, that can be interpreted in different ways, I suppose. So we'll just have to see. And I think this time around, I think China is more prepared for Trump in a way. So they know that sometimes, he will be very vocal about things, but then in the end, maybe he will try to, or the countries will try to kind of solve things, like, for instance, TikTok. Now, Trump is not so sure if he will close it down, but he wants half of the company in the U.S., but it was kind of postponed, the decision, I think, to ban TikTok in the U.S. So things, I mean, he's also very... could be changed quickly, it seems. So China is kind of prepared, I think, for that. But we'll have to see, in the coming years. It's his, the U.S. New presidency just began, and I mean there have been already, some talks, I think, between China and the U.S. So hopefully, it will be okay.
A great conclusion is hopefully it will be okay, and things can change quickly, and let's hope that they are for the better. And thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you for listening.